The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Two police officers have been shot during a protest outside Ferguson, Missouri. This happened just a couple of hours after the city's police chief quit, following a pretty damning U.S. Justice Department report into his police force. And the latest news we have is that the officers are in serious condition at an area hospital. St. Louis County Police Chief John Belmar told reporters early on Thursday that a 41-year-old officer was struck in the shoulder and a 32-year-old officer was hit in the face about midnight last night. Supposedly, the crowd was starting to break up at the time, and then this happened. Quote from Belmar: "These police officers were standing there and they were shot just because they were police officers. I have said all along that we cannot sustain this forever without problems." A new police source today also says that both of the officers are expected to live. We have some pretty blurry and chaotic video near the shooting. You'll hear the shots ring out. This, of course, is all in the context of the shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson, who was ultimately not indicted in that shooting. We have seen other instances of unarmed black men, often very young men, sometimes kids, shot in other places in the United States. We had the high-profile Eric Garner case here in New York City, and there have been a number of protests around the country. And I have to say, I have a really bad feeling about the fallout and the reactions to this shooting, because it seems very likely to me that everyone is going to handle this pretty poorly. The racists will obviously dehumanize the people of Ferguson. They'll act as though they all support this violence. They'll point out Ferguson is 2/3 black, and that all of this started around the shooting of a black teenager, and they will use this as evidence to further racial hatred. Some will be saying, hey, the police at this point deserve whatever they get because they are just so bad and so evil. And then some will stop just short of that and kind of apply a selective indifference to what happened to these police officers. And corporate media will more than likely just rile everybody up. I'm thinking of Don Lemon on CNN. I'm thinking of all of Fox News and right-wing media, each riling people up in different ways. And I truly don't see the reaction to this, which is just absolutely horrible. I mean, the chaos, think about the level of chaos that has been taking place now for month after month after month, with some breaks, albeit some breaks in the Ferguson area. I don't think the reactions from anybody are going to be helping the situation. And this is getting to be such an insane situation that it's not even that shocking to think that people's reactions are going to detract from any kind of resolution rather than help a solution. We will continue to follow this particular shooting. It's not clear right now what information is available about the suspect in this shooting, but we will provide all of that information to you as we get it. Insanity from Senator Lindsey Graham. Remember earlier this week, I told you that Senator Lindsey Graham, he was brought on Meet the Press, and he was there to talk about how bad it was that Hillary Clinton was using her personal email address while Secretary of State. And during that interview, it was revealed that Lindsey Graham, who's only 59 years old and was in his 30s when email became a more prominent thing, has never sent an email in his life. And not only is he on there commenting about Hillary Clinton's use of email, he's also on a committee that makes law around privacy and technology. So that was earlier this week. And things are getting even worse now for Lindsey Graham. He said that if he were to become president in 2016, I don't really know if Lindsey Graham is going to run. I don't think he would have a shot at the nomination if he did. But he said if he were to become president in 2016, this was at the Politics and Pies Forum in Concord, New Hampshire, he said that his first act as president would be to deploy the military in Washington, D.C., to force Congress to reverse cuts to defense and intelligence budgets. Here are his exact words, quote, "And here's the first thing I would do if I were president of the United States. I wouldn't let Congress leave town until we fix this. I would literally," the use of the word literally is important. You'll find out why in a second. "I would literally use the military to keep them in if I had to. We're not leaving town until we restore these defense cuts. We are not leaving town until we restore the intel cuts." So Lindsey Graham is saying he would use the military to force members of Congress not just to vote on the bill, but to pass it, because he didn't say, "I would keep them in town under threat of military action by using the military until they discuss or vote on the bill." No, he said, "I would literally keep them in town by force of the military until they vote on the bill in a particular way that restores the cuts." So Lindsey Graham, this is just one Republican, right? Not everybody would do this, but Lindsey Graham, as an example, would, as his first act as this hypothetical president, use military force to pass his personal agenda in a way that is not legal. This is called a self-coup, when a legitimate leader, presumably Lindsey Graham, legitimately elected president, would use the military or another armed force to unlawfully seize more power than that which is permitted to them under the Constitution. Forcing the passage of bills is not permitted, if you didn't know, for the president to do under the Constitution. Now, what happened after Lindsey Graham said this? Well, Lindsey Graham's spokesperson clarified to Bloomberg. Remember, Lindsey Graham said, "I would literally use the military to force the passage of this bill." The spokesperson said that comment should not be taken literally. So Lindsey Graham says that he would literally do something, and the explanation, after it's recognized how utterly absurd the comment was, is that it should not be taken literally. Have you ever heard doublespeak that is more literal than this? "I am literally going to do this. You're misunderstanding." His comment should not be taken literally, in spite of the fact that he used the term literally in explaining it. And meanwhile, while we have one potential Republican nominee hopeful saying he would use the military to force passage of bills in a completely unconstitutional way, you have a wing of the Republican Party that continues to say that President Obama is the tyrant. He is tyrannical because of his executive actions, fewer executive actions than other presidents in recent history. Let's all take refuge for a second in the reality that Lindsey Graham will not be the Republican nominee, never mind being president. Here's a really funny clip. This is one of my favorite things we've played for you in a while. Recently, Venezuela accused the United States of plotting another coup. And this led to State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki to make a statement about this. And she wrote it off. She said it's ludicrous that the United States is involved in a coup in Venezuela, but she went a little too far. And she said something that really made some of the reporters in the room laugh. Check this out. I love this.
President Maduro last night went on the air and said that they'd arrested multiple people who were allegedly behind a coup that was backed by the United States. What is your response?
These latest accusations, like all previous such accusations, are ludicrous. As a matter of longstanding policy, the United States does not support political transitions by non-constitutional means. Political transitions must be democratic, constitutional, peaceful, and legal. We've seen many times that the Venezuelan government tries to distract from its own actions by blaming the United States or other members of the international community for events inside Venezuela. These efforts reflect a lack of seriousness on the part of the Venezuelan government to deal with the grave situation it faces.
The U.S. has The U.S. has a long-standing practice of not promoting. What did you say? How long-standing is that? I would. In particular, in South and Latin America, that is not a long-standing practice.
Well, my point here, Matt, without getting into history, is that we do not support, we have no involvement with, and these are ludicrous accusations.
The U.S. actually has a very long history of supporting overthrows of foreign governments, or as the State Department spokesperson said, non-democratic regime change. I think that's kind of the code word. Remember enhanced interrogation techniques instead of torture? non-democratic regime change or government overthrows, also known as coups. And it's so funny that she says that there's this long-standing policy, because let me break it down for you a little bit. Iran in 1953, a non-democratic regime change supported by the United States. Guatemala in 54, Congo in 1960, the Dominican Republic in 1961, South Vietnam in 1963, Brazil in 1964, Chile in 1973, Iraq in the first Gulf War back in 1992, and even very recently, the U.S. has been trying to influence regime change and overthrows of governments in Iran, in Syria, on and on. And just a year ago, the U.S. trying to get involved and influence regime change in the Ukrainian revolution. Sometimes something is so ridiculous that it's hard to even break it down and analyze it in its component pieces, because it's so inaccurate that it is laughable. And I actually sympathize with the reporter for finding this funny, but as funny as it is frustrating how officials in this country, in many countries, but we're in this country, I'll talk about this country, officials outright lie without seeming to have any fear at all of censure or of discipline or of getting fired. This is a complete, it's literally a laughable untruth that led to people in the room laughing at the ridiculous nature of it. And there probably won't be repercussions for the State Department spokesperson. Am I missing something here? Am I seeing something incorrectly? Let me know on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is indeed funded by our audience. If you've been listening to our podcast, if you've been watching us on YouTube or on Free Speech TV or on any of the 180 radio and television stations that broadcast our show, consider supporting the work that we do. We always have and always will offer the full show for free to everybody to listen to, but we do depend on the support of some of our audience to make that financially viable. And in exchange, we offer a bunch of great benefits to people who do choose to support our program financially. You can find out more about this at davidpakman.com/membership. And today's new member of the day is Aaron Bjorn Bjornsson. And I don't know if Aaron Bjorn Bjornsson is Icelandic or what country Aaron Bjorn is from, but this reminds me of a fascinating culture moment that I had when I flew to Paris last year. You may remember I talked about this trip. I flew on Icelandair. And there was a moment when we were at, I believe it was JFK or maybe it was Newark Airport, in the waiting area to get on our flight because we flew through Reykjavik. And they made an announcement that they needed a few people to come to the desk. And it was, I'm not exaggerating you, something along the lines of, we need passengers Bjorn Jurgensen and Jürgen Bjornsson, et cetera, to come to the counter. And as I looked around, I was in a crowd of people that all looked what you would consider stereotypically Scandinavian. And I realized how out of place I was. There were some Americans on this flight, but really not that many. And it was actually a very fun moment. And I just the few hours I spent in the Reykjavik airport made me want to hopefully soon plan a trip to Iceland. It seems like a fascinating place. And it brought back memories. Today's new member of the day, Aaron Bjorn Bjornsson. Thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Aaron Bjorn at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's recommendation is a documentary. It's a documentary that deals with religion, but it is a little different than many of the ones I've recommended in the past, like Religulous and others. This is called The Overnighters. It's from last year. It was written, directed, and produced by Jesse Moss. And the story is sort of based around people from different parts of the U.S. who go to North Dakota for the oil boom, and they want to get jobs there. And the jobs pay pretty well. But they find out very quickly that there's very little affordable housing available there while they're looking for jobs. And then the story focuses on a particular local Christian pastor who over time has allowed something like 1,000 of these job seekers to stay at his Williston, North Dakota church over a period of about a couple of years. I don't want to say too much about it. The pastor is fascinating. He will strike you as a very different type of Christian than the ones that we often criticize on this program. There's also an anti-gay component, though, to the story, and there's a very big twist in the documentary as well. I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to give it away, but I could not more highly recommend this film from 2014 documentary called The Overnighters. It is on Netflix. And if you're watching this on YouTube, in the description, we'll set up a link to stream the movie on Amazon. And if you use that link, we actually do get a little bit of a kickback from Amazon for that. You can help to support our show while checking out the recommendations. The Overnighters, I was not expecting what it ended up being when I started watching this documentary. A man has received a 13-year prison sentence for having 2 joints worth of pot. This is a 49-year-old African-American father of 7. He's been sentenced to 13 years in jail for possessing what is essentially the amount of marijuana that would go into 2 joints, 2 marijuana cigarettes. And we're talking about Bernard Noble, who's a resident of New Orleans. He's now in a Louisiana prison. And the Orleans Parish Public Defenders have been campaigning to free Noble, saying on their website, Bernard Noble, a 49-year-old native of New Orleans and father of 7 children, is currently serving 13.3 years in the Jackson Parish Correctional Center in Jonesboro, Louisiana. His crime, possession of 2.8 grams, not ounces, 2.8 grams of marijuana. This is roughly, as I said, enough marijuana to roll 2 joints, less than is now legal in more and more states. For this, Bernard Noble has been separated from his family that he's been actively working to support, overpaying his child support, and being the kind of father we all hope a man would be. This was a mandatory minimum sentence, and I have no expectation, maybe you disagree, I have no expectation at all that the Louisiana governor, Republican Bobby Jindal, is going to grant any sort of clemency to Bernard Noble anytime soon. He is sort of a right-wing tool of grandiose ignorance who is not going to alienate voters in any way. And this would be a move that would alienate many of his potential supporters. This story crosses so many issues. Generally, of course, it's about the war on drugs and the failure of the war on drugs, the bankrupt nature of these attempts at supposedly increasing public safety when we know that the basis of the war on drugs was out-and-out racism in the wake of the 1960s civil rights movement. But it's also about the disproportionate application of nonviolent drug sentences depending on race, depending on class, depending on your ability to hire a great lawyer. And it's also a story about mandatory minimum sentences, which is something that we have talked about critically for many years. And we really need to examine once again the entire concept of mandatory minimum sentences. And lastly, even though only 10%, roughly 8 to 10% of US prisoners are held by for-profit prisons, corporate influence on prisons is a big deal because of those mandatory minimums. Private prison companies like CCA, which I believe is a Corrections Corporation of America, something like that, they lobby hard for mandatory minimums because the more set in stone or on paper it is that people must go to prison for X amount of time, the bigger the pool is, so to speak, of people that can make money sitting in prison for these private prison corporations. So this story is a huge story with various implications. And as we step back, I think the key thing to remember is what was said by the Orleans Parish Board, which is this is an amount of marijuana that is not illegal in many states. and not illegal in terms of decriminalization, and flat out legal recreationally in an increasing amount of states, and 13.3 years in prison with no benefit to society. Let's be honest. This is a man who was working for his family. Now that his family no longer has his financial support, isn't that going to lead to a worse situation for that family? Aren't these the types of situations where you all of a sudden lose all income that can lead to people making bad decisions for themselves and their loved ones? There is no social benefit to imprisoning this man for 13 years for 2.8 grams of marijuana, and it just could not be more clearly outlined by this story. I got an interesting voicemail that I want to address, not at the end of the show, because I actually want to talk about this, about political debates and offending people. This is something I've spoken about before. Let's listen first to the voicemail, and then I'll talk about it. Very interesting.
Hi, guys. I remember a while back you talked about that I shouldn't fall into the trap when someone says that I am insulting their personal beliefs by having an opinion about, some issue.
Right.
But I don't really remember exactly what you guys said about how to circumvent that argument. And I find myself getting kind of trapped when someone brings up that issue as a counter argument to my own opinion. So I would love it if you guys could explain a little bit on how I can get around that ridiculous facade of an argument. Thanks.
So I mentioned this a while back because I told the story where years ago I interviewed a Christian homeschooler, and I said to the Christian homeschooler during an interview, hey, do you think it really makes sense to inform someone's scientific worldview in school or in homeschooling when your worldview is based on a carpenter in the sky who was born to a virgin, blah, 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 blah. I said something like that. And the Christian homeschooler I was interviewing, Mike McHugh, came back at me and said, you have offended me personally with that. And I backed off. And a couple years later, I talked to Tom Hartman about this, progressive radio host Tom Hartman, and he said, oh, see, David, what I would have done is when someone says they're offended, I go right at that. I say, why is that offensive? Explain to me why it's offensive, because saying that something is offensive is not actually a counter argument. It's a way to shut down debate. Now, the way I would handle it now in a confrontational interview is not necessarily the way you might want to handle it with your loved ones or with friends or family or whoever it is. But you have to the context you have to remember is that someone taking offense has no bearing whatsoever on the validity of what you're saying or of what they're saying. So I think the best thing, if it were in an interview on the show, I would go at it pretty aggressively. But if it were a personal conversation, what I would think of doing is saying, my intention is not to offend you, but let's not forget that being offended doesn't impact whether what I'm saying is true. Let's focus on whether what I'm saying is true and explore the facts. And that's I think the best recommendation. The exact way that you say it would probably depend on who you're talking to. And as a background context, let's not forget that if someone is offended by something, it's definitely worth exploring. Maybe it's worth exploring because you're out of line and you really did say something insulting. But at the same time, if it's with, the context I think of is mostly with religious beliefs. People get offended when the religious beliefs are questioned. My view is that if those religious beliefs are really based on hard evidence and are accurate and believable, that they should not be offended. They should simply be able to come back and tell you, this is why you're wrong and this is why my belief is true. So absolutely don't allow offense to diffuse the debate over what are probably pretty worthwhile issues.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Harvey Kaye, who is professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, also author of the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. And our topic today is the rise of right-wing anti-intellectualism. As a kind of historical context, Harvey, Where do you see this dating back to? When did we first start to see this?
Well, I think throughout American history, we've seen examples of conservative forces, whether they be on among the Republicans or the Democrats, a certain hostility to intellectualism. In part, that it goes all the way back to the idea that intellectuals are the folks who came over from Europe and brought their dangerous ideas with them. You know, whether they were Jacobins of the French, friends of the French Revolution, or later abolitionists of a sort, or even later socialists and anarchists. So there's that fear of ideas as somehow alien to America, which fails to appreciate the degree to which America's greatest political figures, from Jefferson and Thomas Paine all the way through to the likes of Martin Luther King, have all been, in their fashion, intellectuals. And even our greatest presidents, most especially the likes of Abraham Lincoln, have given us words and ideas that clearly rank among the greatest intellectual ideas of their day. But in any case, I think if we talk about the contemporary conservative, we have to see the degree to which the building in the wake of McCarthyism and all that, the building, especially in the 1970s, of the new conservative movement, which relied so much on two major foundations: one, the corporate world, and on the other, the world of Christian fundamentalism and evangelicalism, that these provided a certain kind of antagonism to ideas and indeed intellectuals. When the Trilateral Commission, which was by no means specifically Republican, but rather an elite organization of business and related folk, gathered in the early 1970s, worried about the fact that the United States was becoming too democratic, that we were suffering a crisis of democracy, an excess of democracy. They included on their list of antagonists not only the media but also universities. The fear of ideas emanating from academia that somehow threatened their power, their authority, their capacity to decide how they wanted to pursue their profits. The believing that intellectuals were going to impose regulations and controls on them regarding the environment, workplace practices, and so on, which indeed they were doing.
Well, it
seems
seems like today, not to interrupt, but there was a lot there, and I kind of want to look into some of those things more specifically. It seems like today this issue of the threat to conservative ideals is an important piece through which the anti-intellectual movement is being informed. I mean, we saw a number of Republican candidates, including people like Rick Santorum, talk very negatively about the concepts of higher education, and we're never going to have the smart, educated people on our side, kind of as an ad hominem that ended up becoming kind of a funny joke. But we're seeing that the sense of higher education as a threat to conservative ideals become very forefront today.
Well, I can tell you that you struck a decidedly personal note for me right now. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin system, and not only are we about to suffer a $300 million budget cut, and may well lose members of the faculty in the course of those cuts. When Scott Walker proposed the cuts, he also proposed the idea of a public authority for higher education. That is, that he presented it as if this was going to liberate the university from direct state control. But the most telling thing in his effort to rewrite the relationship between the state and public higher education is that he wanted to remove, he had already edited out, excised out, crossed out the line in education in the state, the commitment, as we called it, the Wisconsin idea, to one, the pursuit of truth, and then the pursuit of public service, which is to say academics, intellectuals would not only sort of talk to each other, but would take their learning and their ideas and project it to the borders of the state. Can you imagine trying to excise from higher education's purpose the pursuit of truth? That tells you a great deal, doesn't it, about the politics of conservative Republicans?
It certainly does, and I think that there's kind of two sides to this. There's, of course, the kind of propagandist side, which is the attacks and the negative comments around the ideas of thinking and higher education and a search for truth. And then we can look at kind of the pragmatic steps that the anti-intellectual right is taking. I think defunding education is certainly a huge one. We've seen the rewriting of textbooks in Texas and in other parts of the United States. What else is being done pragmatically to try to push back against what seems to be this kind of, and I hesitate to even call it an intellectual movement. It's just that there's an anti-movement.
Well, it's an interesting point. And one of the things that I've sort of found myself doing is saying, have I been around so long that everything old is new again? If you look at the literature that's come out from the right, built into it is a decided, a persistent attack on intellectuals, a persistent attack on dissident ideas. But the way I reviewed a book for the Daily Beast titled "The Shame" by the renowned Black conservative intellectual, or people like to combine the terms conservative and intellectual, by the Black conservative writer Shelby Steele, who's at the renowned conservative think tank, the Hoover Institution, and it's a straight-out assault on not simply on liberal politics, but a straight-out assault on liberal ideas, and basically that liberal ideas for these last 40 and 50 years have promoted a kind of politics and ideology that has led minorities, and most especially African Americans, to suffer and basically to become dependents of the state and indeed the liberal elite. I mean, if you look at the writings of conservatives these days, the arguments that we associated with Rush Limbaugh over these many decades are now becoming, if you like, sort of the words and ideas even of folks who posture as themselves intellectuals. When I read Shelby Steele's work, I kept thinking, haven't I heard this before? Haven't I read this before? Perhaps in a cruder fashion from Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and others. So I think there's that. I think as well we have to consider the degree to which, if you look at the so-called mainstream media, the absence of liberal left voices and the inclusion in the media conversation of folks who appear to be liberal because they have more of a mind than others, perhaps, and they've given more attention to ideas, but often they're as centrist can be. There is, as I said, this exclusion from any kind of, it used to be the case they would say, well, look, Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn are excluded from mainstream public debates. I mean, the degree to which the left broadly is excluded nowadays.
Don't you think that there could be another strategy for the anti-intellectual right, which is to try to intellectualize their positions? And we've seen this happen in kind of small instances, sometimes around, you'll have Christian apologists who present their right-wing ideas as kind of pseudo-intellectual. We see it in little instances, sometimes with taxation and supply-side economics. But broadly speaking, it hasn't been done that much.
Well, I think one element that I'd like to remind us all of is this. Ever since Ronald Reagan began his move himself towards something of the center, at least his rise to the presidency in the 1970s, what we've seen is this concerted effort on the part of conservatives to lay claim to American history, from the American Revolution all the way through, and in laying claim to American history, to lay claim to the ideal, to patriotism, indeed to ideas that were very fundamental to liberal, progressive, and radical thought for 200 years, going back to Thomas Paine, and that is that America was perhaps indeed exceptional, not exceptional in the sense of superior to us, but projected as an exceptional set of ideas having to do with freedom, equality, and democracy. And our task was to try to live up to those ideas and to advance them. And nowadays, what we've seen is that conservatives who for 200 years did everything in their power to suppress the memory of the likes of Thomas Paine, have appropriated such folks, completely removed any of the sort of progressive radical elements of the ideas, pulled out of context their words and used them as if they're the ones who represent American history, that they're the ones who represent American patriotism. Indeed, as if they're the ones who can tell us what makes America exceptional, and somehow that always seems to refer to a kind of superiority. No, I mean, it's an across-the-board campaign on everything from history to political economy, in which the ideas of again, liberals, progressives, and radicals are marginalized. We saw it in its worst form, of course, during the McCarthy period. But we see it today in a sense where driven from the public square. In fact, it's funny, what is it, about 10, 15, 20 years ago, they talk about religion being driven from the public square. Now it seems that anyone with serious ideas is being driven from the public square if they're not speaking a conservative rhetoric.
Very, very interesting and important topic. We've been speaking with Harvey Kaye, professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Thanks so much for being on.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I just read this morning about a really interesting study that's coming out in the journal Psychological Bulletin, and it was done by researchers at the University of Buffalo School of Management. And they compiled 31 years of research into narcissism with almost 500,000 participants. And they've determined that on average, men are more narcissistic than women. The quote is, "Narcissism is associated with various interpersonal dysfunctions, including an inability to maintain healthy long-term relationships, unethical behavior, and aggression." That's according to the lead author, Emily Grijalva, PhD, assistant professor of organization and human resources at the University of Buffalo School of Management. They also went on to say, at the same time, narcissism is shown to boost self-esteem, boost emotional stability, and the tendency to emerge as a leader. By examining gender differences in narcissism, we may be able to explain gender disparities in these important outcomes. This is so interesting because the initial reaction online has been from so-called men's rights activists to absolutely flip out without realizing that the study, while saying that men appear to be more narcissistic, also points to narcissism as a reason for which there may be more men in positions of power that would not be connected to sexism. So I think a lot of the men's rights activists and anti-feminists are not actually realizing the point that this makes. Now, the biggest issue I have with the study is that some are jumping right away and saying, well, there's a causal relationship here, right? Men are somehow genetically or inherently more narcissistic. But I want to present a different idea. What about the fact that boys from a young age in the United States, generally by media and by society, with the exception of some parents, are more often socialized to hide feelings, to be strong, to appear unaffected by strife or conflict or trauma than girls? And we could easily imagine how that type of conditioning as kids would lead to a kind of a blowback effect of being more narcissistic as adults, because remember that the study only looked at adults. So for those who are criticizing the study by saying, hey, it's saying that men are inherently more narcissistic, let's remember that correlation and causation are different things, and we actually may have environmental or cultural factors that are leading to this. But at the same time, the feminist movement should be aware of the fact that there's another interesting argument being made here, which is if narcissism is connected with increased self-esteem, more comfort in a leadership position and whatever, there could be, and I'm not making this argument, let me make this clear, I'm not making this argument, I'm saying that there is a discussion to be had about what this would suggest if true, that we could see gender disparities in certain types of positions because of male narcissism. I will leave it there. We're hoping to get some of the people involved in this study on the show and we can discuss this further. But I think a lot of people in reading the study on both sides, on the self-described feminist side, on the self-described described men's rights movement side, and just people who are reading it are missing some of the important elements here. Really interesting report from the UK, which says that electric cars could cut the UK's oil imports by 40% by 2030. An electric vehicle surge would deliver an average of 1,000 British pounds of fuel savings per year per driver. And this could lead to a 47% drop in carbon emissions by 2030, and obviously a huge decrease in reliance on oil imports. This data is from the UK. It's not from the United States, but given that both countries rely on oil imports, although I believe the UK to a slightly greater degree than the United States, the UK also a much smaller country than the United States, we would see a huge impact here in the US as well. And the counter argument is, well, David, you get electric cars, fine, but the electricity is also coming from fossil fuels, including coal and other dirty fuel sources. Absolutely. I have been making that argument for many years. When we talk to energy experts who advocate electric vehicles, I say, well, you get dirty electricity to power your vehicle as opposed to dirty gasoline. But that's okay. First, we reduce the amount of oil that we need, and then simultaneously we work up the chain. First, the car doesn't use fossil fuels directly. Next, the electricity doesn't come from fossil fuels. Once the car runs on electricity, you plug it into the wall. The car is off of direct fossil fuels. You can change the source of that electricity fueling the wall outlet in a way that doesn't impact the driver at all. So for the driver to go from gasoline to electric, they have to get an electric vehicle. Once they have one, they don't have to do anything to go from fossil fuel electric to renewable electric. So I sympathize with that argument that most of our electricity is still coming from fossil fuels in this country. But let's just start working up the chain and progress on this. And this is also a national security issue. As we've talked about before, we are more free to make decisions that are logical in terms of alliances, in terms of treaties and other issues with other countries, if we don't depend on them to drive our cars around. And we've talked about the Saudi Arabian alliance, which I think is an absolute abomination as they behead people weekly, and we continue to maintain this alliance with them. We would have more clout, or said differently, we would be less dependent on that alliance if we weren't tied in to the stability of the foreign oil market. And I think we absolutely need to be pushing in this direction. I'm starting to think now, I have just under 3 years on my current car lease of getting an electric vehicle in 3 years, and they're going to be far more widely available at that time. And hopefully, I think now 3 to 5% of our electricity comes from renewable sources. Hopefully it will be closer to, I don't know, maybe 10% in 3 years, 9 or 10%. Maybe that's a little optimistic, but we can be hopeful. Any comments at all on today's show? Call 219-2-DAVID-P and leave us a voicemail. Here is a ringing endorsement of the bonus show. Take a listen.
Hey guys, this is Tom from Seattle. I'm a longtime listener, but a newer subscriber. Thank you for all you do. It's super important work. Shout out to just all your listeners. You guys gotta listen to the bonus show. It was one of the coolest surprises to hear just a different type of show. If you like the David Pakman show, it's similar. David's on it, but it is so good. It is funny. Lewis is uncut. It's raw, and it's different. But it was such a fun surprise for me as a listener.
Yeah, I could not agree more with this individual. This individual has not been paid to say this. The bonus show is fantastic. Lewis is great on the bonus show. Lewis swears on the bonus show. It's a whole different scene. And on today's bonus show, we will talk about Netflix crushing cable TV and the future of Netflix and similar services. We will talk about a new Time magazine cover that makes it look like Hillary Clinton has horns coming out of her head. And this weekend, we've got some really exciting changes coming to the David Pakman Show website, including the mobile version of the David Pakman Show website, which essentially has not existed up until a few days from now, hopefully. And we will talk about all of that and more on today's bonus show. davidpakman.com/membership to join today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.